I'm Naomi DeWinter, and I serve as the president of Muscatine Community College. On behalf of our college community, we welcome you to tonight's lecture with the author of Reading with Patrick, Michelle Kuo. Michelle is on her 12th hour or so at MCC already tonight. She had an early pickup, and she has worked with our students facilitating writing workshops. And I was able to sit in on a couple of those earlier today, and I know that the students really appreciated her attention and her patience with their writing, and they learned so much from her. So many of our English classes have been reading the book, Reading with Patrick, and I know we're excited to hear the discussion of that book tonight. Her book has had numerous praise and has been characterized as being honest, thoughtful, and humane, generous, humble, and wise, gorgeous, and heartbreaking. Michelle Kuo taught English at an alternative school in the Arkansas Delta. After teaching, she attended Harvard Law School and worked as a lawyer for undocumented immigrants in the Fruitvale district of Oakland, California, with a focus on tenants and workers' rights. She now teaches courses on race, law, and soon creative writing at the American University of Paris, and has taught at the Prison University Project at San Quentin Prison. She's actually been in Iowa for almost 2 weeks, working at the University of Iowa and in their prison education program. I should mention that Michelle will be signing books after her presentation, and her books are for sale at Barnes & Noble right behind me, and they are at a 20% discount this evening. I want to thank our partners for this evening's presentation: League of Women Voters, University of Iowa Center for Human Rights, Muscatine Arts Council, and Alexander Clark Group. Also, special thanks to Lisa Powell, our English instructor, way in the back. I know many of our students have her. Lisa embraced this idea of inviting Michelle from the very beginning. So, Michelle Kuo.
Hello, good evening. How's everybody doing?
Good.
I'm so delighted to be here today. I had the honor to work with 2 different writing workshops today. And I'd like to thank Naomi for having me here. Lisa Powell, you're amazing. I love your classes. And then Lisa McKay is also here. And if the students in their writing workshops today can just raise their hands and stand up, perhaps. Sorry to embarrass you. Don't hate me. I loved working with you today. It was such a privilege. You wrote such gorgeous writing. And before we start, I just want to take a moment to thank the people in this room who have been teachers, or are teachers, or principals, or educators. This is a book about teaching and how hard teaching is. So if you could just stand up if you've been a teacher or an educator, I would really love that, just to see who's in this room. If you are a student, oh my God.
Typical reaction.
If you're a student who has ever had a teacher who made you feel smart, I'd like you to raise your hand. Thank you. And I'm sorry to do this, but this is partly what the book is about. If you've ever had a teacher who made you feel stupid, I'd like you to raise your hand. Yeah. This is a bit of the tone that I want to begin with. How do we think about our classroom? How do we approach the classroom as teachers and students? How do we create spaces where we feel smart? And I'm going to start by just telling you the story of this book. I know a lot of you, the students I met today, have questions, so I want to make sure I leave time for questions. And I'm going to share with you two parts of the book. I've had the privilege of teaching at the Oakdale prison in Iowa City this past 2 weeks, and I asked the incarcerated students which passages I should read today, and so they gave me some advice. This book really begins when I'm 22. I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan. I've graduated from college and I've studied the civil rights movement. And I decided that I want to go to the Arkansas and Mississippi Delta because it's a place that is considered one of the poorest in the country. It's majority African American. It's a place where the poverty can be traced directly to slavery. This is a place where Martin Luther King, a man who has seen a lot already, wept when he saw 4 kids sharing an apple. It's a place where Stokely Carmichael came up with the phrase Black Power. And when I go 50 years after the civil rights movement, it's a place that's still poor, still segregated, and still dramatically in need of change. I'm assigned to a school for kids who have been kicked out of other schools. And I'm extremely idealistic, perhaps naively idealistic, and I think that I can change the lives of my students. The first 2 chapters is a march through mistakes that I make as a teacher. One of the first mistakes that I make is that I want to teach the history of violence against African Americans. This is the history that moved me in college. This is history where we understand that 6 million African Americans moved from the South to the North to escape violence. And these students are 15 and 16, and I think that this will help them connect to their own history. This is a school, just to explain, where half the teachers are substitutes, where we have no guidance counselor, but we do have a police officer. It's a school where when students get into fights, the kids get sent to jail. So it's a school that solves problems through punishment. In Arkansas, also corporal punishment is legal. So I was given a paddle that had holes in it to make it more aerodynamic because that would make it swing faster. It's a place also where every kid knows somebody who has been incarcerated. In teaching students a history of violence against African Americans, I thought that I could connect them to their own history. One of the first things I had, and it was really hard for me to write this scene because I felt so like, I think the hard thing about writing is telling other people about things where you've messed up on. And I pass out a picture of a kid, of a person who has been lynched. I was also given these pictures in high school. And one of the students has a reaction that I want. He says, "Ms. Quo, this ain't right. Who is this? Where did this happen?" And then he passes this picture, and then another student takes the picture, turns it face down, and puts his head down. As a teacher, you're constantly worried that kids will think you're weak, you don't know how to assert authority. So I go to him, I try to improve my posture. I go to him and I say, "You know you're not allowed to have your head down in this class." And the kid doesn't raise his head, he just says, "Ms. Quo, don't nobody want to see that." In this moment, I know I've crossed a line. I've done something wrong. But I'm 22. I still don't know exactly what that wrong thing is. But I know that I need to change how I'm teaching this. Somehow the attitude isn't quite right. Around the same time, I look at the walls of my classroom. And they seem like appropriate walls. They're covered with pictures of African American heroes, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Malcolm X. Heroes that I think the students will connect with. But the walls still don't reflect the students themselves, who they are, who they contain. And so I started asking myself, who do the kids think, who do they think they are? What do they want to contain? And I started to have students writing about their own lives, writing about books that they want to read. And I realized that what the students want to read is completely different and surprising and unpredictable. So one student wants to read about 17th century Japan. Another student wants to read about Kung Fu stories. Another student wants to read about the North Pole expeditions. Yet another student wants to read science fiction, fantasy, historical fiction, children's books, cookbooks. There's such a wealth of curiosity, and that once I realized this, I realized that the walls were completely wrong. Instead of filling students up with who I thought they should contain, I should also fill up the walls with themselves. The students started to take pictures of themselves, reading, writing, and the walls became covered also with pictures of themselves that were just as large as the posters, pictures of their own writing, their own work, pictures also of their family. So it became really more of our classroom rather than my idea. And around this time, I started to understand the mistake I made. I was bringing into the classroom my own liberal anger and outrage, my own attitude as an outsider of what people should learn, rather than really trying to figure out who each student was. The second mistake I made was that I didn't know how to respond to people responding to me being Asian American. Does anybody have any guesses how many Asian Americans were in Helena, Arkansas? There was like me. There was the Chinese people who owned a Chinese restaurant. And there was this one other woman named Grace who was my buddy. We used to hang out a lot. I think she has a different name in the book. So this is a really fundamental truth that I'm sure everybody in this room knows. If you don't really know yourself, you're going to push people away. And you're going to take it personally when they try to push your buttons. So the students would ask me, do you know Yao Ming? Do you know Jackie Chan? Are you related to them? And because I was so nervous, I didn't know very much about being Asian American, I assumed that they were trying to agitate me or antagonize me. And I think some were, but I think some genuinely had never met an Asian American before in their lives, because I live in a rural area where there are very few Asian immigrants. So the second thing that happened in the classroom, remember this is a classroom of all African American students and me. So we were just trying to get to know each other, to figure out what our boundaries were. I learned to joke back with students. I was like, oh, when they said, are you related to Yao Ming? I was like, are you related to Kobe Bryant? And they were like, wait, that's not right, Ms. Kuo. And this is around the time where I meet a student named Patrick. He's really bright, he's introspective, he breaks up other fights. He's the kind of student who brings a bucket and a mop when everybody's whining about, when I'm whining about the leak in the roof. He's pretty quiet. He's kind of stays to himself. It's easier to notice other students who are a little louder, who are trying to push your buttons, trying to get your attention. He's the kind of student, I guess he does remind me a little bit of myself when as a kid. I never raised my hand. I always stayed back. I let other students kind of run the show. And I didn't want him to slip through the cracks. Some students have asked me why Patrick, why did you focus on him? And I'll answer that question later. Suffice to say that he did have one problem, which was attendance. As many of you know, I've been talking to principals and educators, we know that the students who don't go to school are the ones who drop out, who fall behind. And I would show up at Patrick's house and be like, you need to come to school. I mean, I wasn't really thinking that something bad would happen. I was just like, oh, I'd like to have Patrick in school, maybe I can get him to come. And he started to come to school. A lot of things in education policy are complicated, but attendance is interesting. If you keep demanding the kid to come, and he's basically interested in coming, he will show up. And so he started to show up to school and started to flourish. He reads a lot, he's writing, he's during silent reading, he's intensely absorbed in his book. During silent reading, in general, students are intensely absorbed in their books. And this is around the time where I've applied to law school and I get into law school. What do I do? Do I go to law school and better myself, improve my education, please my parents, get out of Arkansas, or do I stay in Arkansas, this place where I finally figured out how to do this thing? I'm less lonely than I used to be. How do you make these decisions in your own lives? And I'm just going to read to you what my parents said to me when they came to visit me in Arkansas. My parents are from Taiwan. Has anybody been to Taiwan here? Yeah. It's a tiny island country that's been colonized by 4 or 5 different powers over 4 centuries. It's been colonized by the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Chinese, the Japanese. So it's an island that has gone through a lot. And my parents, when they were growing up, didn't have any idea what a social activist was, a journalist, a writer. I mean, these things were quite foreign to them. So they had no idea why I was teaching. They had no idea what it meant to be an activist. They didn't quite understand who my civil rights heroes were. And I was preparing to tell them that I was thinking of staying in this place, this rural area where people with means tend to leave, people without means tend to stay. And this is my mother, bless her heart. She's actually more crazy than how the book makes her sound. But I love my mom. She's just an intense person. So this is what she says. So I've been thinking I might stay for a couple more years. There's this thing you can do, it's called deferring. Here they said in unison. My father's face contorted, my mother put her hands over her face. Here my dad repeated, shocked. They had already started telling people that I was headed to law school, they said. What was I trying to do? Make liars out of them? If I wasn't really planning to go, why did I bother applying? You're so much smarter than this, my dad continued, waving his hands, gesturing to the street. Are you happy? My mother interrupted. Look at you, she said in Mandarin. Look at your body. She was referring to my weight gain. Do you know how you sound? You don't know. You sound old. You sound so serious. When I talk to you, I think my daughter's forgotten she's young. You don't care about how you look. You don't care that you don't have a boyfriend. It's like you don't want to be happy. It's just school kids, school kids. They're not even your own kids. Do you even want to have kids? All your friends here are couples. They don't care that they're lonely. It's not their fault. It's just how couples are. That is true. Couples don't care when you're single. I care. Only your mom and daddy care. She took a breath. You're not normal. Your cousins, they're normal. They get married, become happy. It's so easy for them. They're so easy. They listen to their parents. What happened to you? You know, nobody wants to be Mother Teresa. I was stunned. I hadn't realized how much they hated that I was here. She kept going. You've changed since you went to college. We shouldn't have sent you to Harvard. Everybody there thinks they can change the world. You think you can? Look at the newspaper. Nothing changes. You think you're so special? You think you're better than your mom and dad because you like to read books, because you like to help people? She laughed derisively. You think your mom and dad don't help people? We help you. We help you go to school. We help you go to college. We give you a house to sleep in, and we work every day. My father gripped his chest as if it hurt. You look down on your parents, he concluded. Then he stood up and walked away, not bothering to wait for my mom. After I left my parents at the airport, I found that I did not want to go home. Instead, I drove up and down Highway 61, my neck in knots, thinking about my parents. Once at a car wash in Kalamazoo, when I was around 10 years old, my dad pulled up behind another car, and we heard a high-pitched scream. Hey! A woman leaned out and shouted at us from behind. You chink and your chink daughter cut in line. Had we in fact cut in line? This is a question that preoccupied me, as I didn't know what a chink was. My dad bolted out of our car and yelled right back at her, you motherfucking bitch. I shrank back. Everybody in the lot would hear my dad say bad words. But to my shock, the woman shrank back too. She hadn't expected that he would talk back. His cursing was fluent. His temper was wild. I was scared he might punch her right there, but he didn't. He returned. Now he was yelling at me as if I had done something wrong. Remember, you're an American. You're an American citizen. You were born here. Do you understand? Do you? At the end of this argument with my parents, they told me if I went to law school, they promised me they would never bother me again. A conversation I should have tape recorded. And I knew it was over. I knew I needed to go to law school. I knew I needed to just let go of this time in my life. My mother was right about a lot of things. I was very lonely in a rural area. You can't date. I never had a relationship. I didn't know what it was like. There was a sense that I would be single forever if I stayed there. So I left. I went to law school. And the story continues where 3 years later in law school, I find out that Patrick has gotten into a fight and killed someone. I just didn't believe it at first. Patrick just wasn't a violent kid. And over when I talk to more people about the book, they have a story of one of their students or somebody they knew who just wasn't a violent kid. One situation happened on one night that changed his life. But because I didn't understand this, I was sure that this somehow wasn't true. And so I flew to Arkansas to see Patrick at the county jail, and he told me what had happened. He told me that his sister, who's younger, who's special ed, his mother had told him to go look for her. He couldn't find her. He came home. He saw her on the way back with an older man in the neighborhood who was extremely drunk. Patrick kept telling him to get off my porch, get off my porch. The guy wouldn't get off his porch. Patrick got a knife and stabbed him. The guy limped away. Patrick thought the guy was fine. The ambulance took a really long time to come. And then the guy died. Patrick is 18 at this point. He dropped out the year after I left Arkansas, so he has an 8th grade education, and he is in jail with a first-degree murder charge. He doesn't want to talk about legal defenses. I've studied criminal law. I know that first-degree murder is an overcharge. This is likely manslaughter. First-degree murder is premeditation. It is buying arsenic, buying poison, buying a gun 5 weeks before the murder and planning to use it 5 weeks later. But he doesn't want to talk about his defense. He doesn't want to talk about self-defense, provocation, the castle doctrine, which is the doctrine that protects you if somebody's on your property. He wants to feel guilty. And this is something that really strikes me and still strikes me a year later, this idea of wanting to feel guilty. I walk out of the jail, and this voice inside me says, you need to come back. If you don't come back, you'll never come back. I have at this point had the same fight with my parents that I had 3 years ago. This time they want me to take a corporate law job rather than a legal aid job. The legal aid job is out at Centro Legal de la Raza. I've met a lot of immigrants and children of immigrants here who speak Spanish, so that work is defending people who get threatened by employers, people getting deported, work that I want to do that feels meaningful. This time I don't ask my parents for permission. I've taken the legal aid job, but I also feel like I can't go straight to California for this job. I need to go back to Arkansas. I go back to Arkansas and I find out that Patrick has a baby daughter. And this is the second thing that I just wanted to read. I think I have a great idea of having him write a letter to his baby daughter. And he hands me back the paper and it says, this is what I write. It was a shock. The writing looked crazed. The blue ink was heavy. The letters looked like jagged marks. I did not recognize his handwriting at all. He wrote to her, hey Cherry, I know I'm not in your life. It's my fault. It hurt me that I'm not there with you. Hear people be arguing about nothing, trying my patience. Sitting here doing nothing but how I messed up, and I'm thinking of you. Love, your daddy. So this letter he writes to her is where he apologizes to her, where he feels he's messed up. How do you convince him that he has something worthwhile to share with her? That his relationship can be more than just apologizing? And this is where I start to bring books to jail. Picture books of trees, of birds, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin. So much poetry. We memorized so much poetry. And I wasn't even quite sure what I was hoping to do with these books. We read a lot of poems, and I'm just going to recite a couple so you can get a sense of what we were doing in jail. First is the haiku, which gets a bad rap because we learned it in kindergarten, but it's actually a masterpiece in Japanese culture. Like if you think about rap battles in 17th century Japan, they were like people competing to top each other's haiku. And here are a few of them. Deer licking first frost off each other's coats, which is about the first day of snow. The deer licking first frost off each other's coats. It's really lovely. My neighbor, how does he live, I wonder? This one is kind of funny. Don't worry, spiders, I keep house casually. Napped half the day, no one punished me. Blossoms at night, faces of people moved by music. So these images of nature, these surprises. Another poem that he really loved was by Derek Walcott, who's amazing. Days that I have held, days that I have lost, days that outgrow like daughters, my harboring arms. Another poem which is really about, well, you can decide what it's about, but it's about how we learn to forgive ourselves, about looking at yourself in the mirror. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who has been with you all your life. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart. I won't continue, but it's a beautiful poem. And Patrick started writing these gorgeous, intricate letters to his daughter, hundreds of letters to his daughter, where he imagined them canoeing down the Mississippi River, where he imagined them on a mountain, where he imagined them reading. And I don't know, one thing that I think about is how many of you feel like there's somebody in your life you have let down? I know we have all had that feeling. And Patrick had that feeling, but he faced that feeling every day, word by word, holding himself accountable. And that is an act of courage. Part of what inspired him to write were the words and language of the writing. So when Marilyn Robinson, these lines of father to his son, and Patrick used those words with his own daughter. I want you to know that if you have ever wondered what you have done in this life, and everyone does wonder sooner or later, you have been, God's grace to me, a miracle, even more than a miracle. The story doesn't end there. For those of you who have read the book, it is not a feel-good story. It's not a savior story. He gets out of prison, and he is still struggling. This is a story about the failure of the welfare state. His food stamps get cut off. Employers won't give him a second chance. His mother, who was his best friend, dies at age 43 from heart disease and diabetes because healthcare is so poor in the Delta. He's been hungry. He has been homeless. And he's still persisting. His daughter is doing incredibly well. She loves reading and literacy. She's in the 5th grade, and he still sees her, reads with her. So I think at the end you're like, well then what, if his life isn't materially transformed, then what good were all of these books, this indisputable transformation he had in jail? There are a few things I want to say about books. Books changed his feeling towards himself. They gave him a language to speak with his daughter. Books gave him access to images of beauty, of the deer, of the mountain, of the water. And the water is especially important because in Helena, a fertilizer company skipped town, so a lot of the water is contaminated. Books gave him courage to face himself. He chose to think rather than to not think. I think that's a big reason why people don't like reading sometimes, is that you have to think. He was reading Frederick Douglass, which put him in a state of panic and anxiety because it was so painful for him to see people tormented by their own knowledge of their condition. And he finished that book in a concrete stairway with no light, which is an act of courage. And finally, I think books gave him a sense of temporary freedom in a place where his liberty was taken away. It gave him a chance possibly to forgive himself briefly. And back to this question of guilt, of wanting to feel guilty. A person will not flourish if he does not feel he deserves to flourish. And the act of reading and writing was a state of self-discipline and of flourishing. I'm going to end just now by asking about myself and why I wrote this. I wrote this because we live in an increasingly unequal world. And in this story, I represent the person who has more power, more educational resources. And it is really uncomfortable to be in relationships of inequality, to be in a relationship with somebody who has more power or less power. And how do we create more equal spaces? How do we create spaces where we feel equal to one another? This is the central question of the book. I don't think I have any easy answers to it, but it's the question that really drives me. I just want to end by reading the Toni Morrison epigraph, and this is for all of you who are writers. How many of you are writers or like to write? Yes? Okay, this is for you. Stop thinking about saving your face. Think of our lives and tell us your world. Make up a story. Narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. We know you can never do it properly once and for all. Passion is never enough, neither is skill, but try. For our sake and yours, forget your name in the street. Tell us what the world has been to you in the dark places and in the light. Language alone protects us from the scariness of things with no names. Language alone is meditation. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to be here, and I can't wait to hear all your questions. While doing legal aid full time, so I think when you're a writer, it's hard to take yourself seriously, and so it was really hard for me to take myself seriously. I think I felt a lot of self-doubt and insecurity, but I wanted to write the story down because I think you write when you feel like you're losing something, when you feel like you're losing somebody, when you're losing a memory of something, and I wanted to write down Patrick's transformation before I would forget it. Yeah. Hi, what's your name?
My name's Kendi.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I was wondering which one of Patrick's writings was your favorite?
That's such a great question. So the last poem in the book is actually, I was so nervous about when I was at the prison last week about whether I asked the incarcerated students, so what don't I understand? Tell me what I don't get. And maybe there